This lesson is about the significance of Hegel and Nietzsche to the understanding of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. If you look at the first column, we've already talked about some of this, but make sure you understand the dates of Hegel. He lived from 1970 to 1831. I would go ahead and highlight that. It's significant to our understanding. Um, then we have his entire name, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and he was born in Germany, in Stuttgart. He began teaching in universities in 1801, and he really taught up until his death in 1818. University of Berlin was where he taught. And I would go ahead and highlight he was one of the most influential German philosophers. And the reason some of his theories have become so significant, even today, these are spoken of in philosophy classes, in law classes. This next statement: to understand human culture, one must first retrace and understand history. That's important. We'll talk about that more in class, but if we think about human culture, the only way we can understand it is to go back. And sometimes we forget what has happened in the past. The next statement: historical approach to human culture inspired by Hegel now includes the study of philosophy, art, science, religion, and politics. So in college studies, you'll be studying him in numerous courses. Um, he also developed what was called his dialectic. Be sure you mark the dialectic. He believed that all historical developments have three basic characteristics. They follow a necessary and inherent course. Each development represents not only change, but also progress. Think about that. And one phase of any um, historical development tends to be confronted and replaced by its opposite. This opposite is then replaced by a phase that resolves the two oppositional phases. And most of you know these. These stages were later called thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And put a little star next to that because we'll talk more about that in class. He applied his dialectic to all areas of human life. And we'll think about Raskolnikov and how all of this related to him. He stated that human desire to gain satisfaction through the external pursuit of power was often rejected in favor of the attempt to achieve an inner balance of tranquility. Now we know that Raskolnikov his desire is to commit murder. Um, it's that external pursuit of power. He wants to be the extraordinary man, but yet there's an inner balance of something good within him. We're going to have to talk more about that, so make sure you're marking that. He first published the book Phenomenology of the Spirit. It dealt with the development of the forms of consciousness or states of mind, the views of the world, religious outlook, ethics. Then he published Science of Logic. It dealt with the development of philosophical theories about reality. He developed and wrote Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, and it's a record of his entire philosophic system. His last book, Philosophy of Right, analyzes the development of social, ethical, and legal systems. So now we're moving into an entire different area. This next, doctrine of the ends justifying the means. Think about Raskolnikov and what he does to Alyona. The idea that useless members of society should be removed to better mankind. That's pretty devastating. But he definitely thought this. And we know that dictators throughout the world have thought this, then the evil of crime can be overridden by good proceeding from it. Raskolnikov thought he would get rid of the old pawnbroker, he would be bettering society. Now, this next part, big star, the Hegelian Superman is superior to the average man, but exists for the betterment of society. And we know from the very beginning of the book, Raskolnikov thinks he's better than all of the poor people around him, but exists for the betterment of society, though his methods may be impure. In other words, so what if I have to kill people? I'm doing it for the betterment of mankind. History is a more powerful force than morality. Now, that's something I really want you to think about and be able to talk to me about in class, because that's a very important statement. History is a more powerful force than morality. What does that mean to you? Now, our next philosopher is, of course, Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a rather young man when Dostoevsky was studying him. He was probably about 37. He lived from 1844 to 1900. Interestingly enough, he was the son and grandson of Protestant ministers. He later, in 1870, became a Swiss citizen. He taught at a university. But his was a fragile existence, you might say. He had a nervous breakdown, which means a mental breakdown. Nietzsche was considered a philosopher, poet, and classical scholar. And notice his name also, Friedrich. Many writers, philosophers, and psychologists of the 1900s have been greatly influenced by him. We're going to be talking more about existentialism and alienation, the loner in our society, and that'll help guide you a little bit more with some of his ideas. He greatly admired Greek society, and I don't know how much you've ever studied about the early Greek society. He wrote something called The Birth of Tragedy, his first book, and it presented a unique and revolutionary theory explaining the nature of Greek society. He stated that the Greek nature could be interpreted best as a conflict between two basic human tendencies. And over the years, I've had many students who said they definitely fell into one of these. The first, the Apollonian tendency, was a desire for clarity and order. Maybe you're the left-handed person. You see things, you're the accountant, you see things, you want everything in order. Or the Dionysian. And the Dionysian tendency was an irrational desire for disorder. Sadly enough, these are artists. The person who's creative, right-brained, you might say. There's that right and left brain ideology. Criticized religion. And this book is very, very famous. A lot of students have read it. I've had it in my classroom, and it gets taken every year I go by it. Thus spake Zisistrata. He proclaimed that God is dead. But he didn't really say that. He really meant God is dead and we killed him. And if you look at the rest of this statement I have here, it meant that religion over time had lost its true meaning and that people needed to seriously reevaluate their traditional values. He believed that religion can no longer serve as the basis of morality. And put a star next to that. We're going to talk more about that in class. He explored the redefinition of God and evil in such works as Beyond God and Evil and Genealogy of Moral. He blamed Christianity for many of society's ills in such works as The Antichrist. And we'll talk more about that. He boasted that he was one of the few philosophers who was also a psychologist. His major contribution to the study of human behavior was the idea that man's actions are motivated by the will to power. You decide if you agree with that statement or you disagree and why. He thought that people wanted to gain power over their own unruly nature more than they wanted to overpower others. That's very interesting. Thought that the self-control exhibited by artists was a higher form of power than physical domination. And I know some of you in here are probably very artistic, so think through that one. His ideal man, the overman or superman, or the Übermensch, as we're going to be reading about, is the individual who controls his passion and directs it to the beneficial ends, taught that people should love their lives. That's also very interesting. The Superman, the extraordinary man, we're going to talk about the differences in those. Often unjustly called a racist, anti-Semite, and breeder of Nazism, largely because of the editing, and this is very sad, happens to many writers, the editing of his writings by Nazi propaganda ministers and by his racist sister Elizabeth. So after his death, many of his writings were tampered with. Man exists to benefit himself, not to help others. We'll talk about that one too. If you see any of this in today's society, let me know. The stronger willed can force their views on others. And this one, put a big star next to truly be a Superman, one must stand alone, away from emotional human contact, and maintain his beliefs. As we go through the text, you may find other characters who fall into either of these two categories. And now, what I would like for you to do for the next class is to take Raskolnikov, and next to each one of the statements, his theory of extraordinary man comes from Hegel, Nietzsche, and his own thoughts. You might then say, men are either ordinary or extraordinary. Would this come from Hegel's theory or Nietzsche's theory? So you're going to write in the margins which one of these two philosophers is Raskolnikov modeling himself after. And remember, I've already told you Dostoevsky hated these two ideas, Hegel's and Nietzsche's. And he took those ideas, he thought it was ruining Europe, its people, its culture, and he wrapped them all up in Raskolnikov to show what can happen if you believe in these ideas. Remember that Dostoevsky was devoutly religious. And we'll talk more about that. So for the next class, just take Raskolnikov and tell me, which of these two philosophers do you find Raskolnikov is modeling? And he's going to have a mixture of both, and then we'll talk about it in class. Hopefully this helped a little bit, me going over it with you. If I were you, I would go ahead and highlight, like I did, one of the most influential German philosophers, and do it in any color you want to. This is for your benefit, and that way we can have a really strong discussion. And I will see you next class. Bye.